On November 13, 2004, Lauri Waterman, a 48-year-old wife and mother, was brutally attacked in her home in the small town of Craig, Alaska. The perpetrators of the attack were two 24-year-old men. One of them, Jason Arrant, was the boyfriend of Lauri's 16-year-old daughter, Rachelle. What the f***? The other was a former boyfriend of Rachelle's named Brian Radel. So wait a minute, we getting set out here? Whatever. Somehow the two love interests of Rachelle had connived to brutally attack her mother, but they were not alone. This attack had the blessing of Rachelle Waterman herself, the daughter of Lauri Waterman. Man, that's screwed up. That's screwed up. Can you imagine your daughter planning to murder you? Son, come on, man. Dragging Lauri out of her home in Craig, Alaska, where she was all alone, Jason and Brian tied her up, forced alcohol down her throat in a bid to create a scene of an accident that would explain her eventual death. After forcing Rachelle's mother to drink alcohol, the two men mercilessly beat her up, and in the process, they suffocated her to death, man. The brutal murder of Lauri Waterman was not an accident. Both Brian and Jason had planned the murder for a long time. However, they planned to make Lauri's death seem like an accident. But now, they had suffocated her to death. Their plan to make her death look like a drunk driving accident would not be convincing enough. The two men decided to make Lauri's death more gruesome. They placed the body in the back of her own van and drove it to a location that was extremely far from her home in Craig, Alaska. With her body in the back of her van, Brian and Jason set the van on fire. The two murderers hoped that the signs of suffocation would be erased, removing any hint of murder, but they were wrong, and they was dumb as hell for even thinking that. By the following afternoon, Lauri Waterman's charred body was found in her burnt down van. 6 days later, Brian Radel and Jason Arrant were arrested by the authorities. What made the case even more intriguing was that Lauri's 16-year-old daughter, Rachelle, was also murdered. Well, arrested, my bad. All three suspects were charged with first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. Craig, Alaska was home to some 1,500 inhabitants. The close-knit community was not accustomed to homicide cases as horrific as the Waterman murder. The biggest crime case that the town had ever experienced took place in 1982 when a mass murder occurred on a 58-foot fishing boat that was tied to the dock on Craig River. The event of his mass murder had haunted the town for years, especially because the culprit was never found. This time around, in the Lauri Waterman's case, the culprits were found. Following the charges against Arrant and Radel, the two men pleaded guilty and took a deal with prosecutors. Arrant confessed to his role in the murder of Lauri Waterman and was eventually sentenced to a maximum of 50 years in prison. Radel, on the other hand, who owned up to being the main player in the murder case, was sentenced to a maximum of 99 years in prison. Part of their plea deal was to testify against Rachelle Waterman, Lauri's teenage daughter, who at the time of her arrest insisted that she was not involved in her mother's death. However, a careful investigation into the case and numerous interviews of the suspects revealed Rachelle's claim of innocence to be totally untrue. Like, what she thought, man? Like, she thought she was just gonna really get away with that shit, man? Whatever, man. To understand how Rachelle got involved in her mother's death, let's examine this somewhat strained relationship that Rachelle had with her mother. See, Rachelle was a very smart student in high school. She was also an athlete who played volleyball and sang in the school choir. Her mom, Lauri, was a special education teacher's aide. She was also a highly active person in her community who always volunteered in her community. For example, she volunteered for service programs and was also an active member of her church. But while from the outside, the Watermans seemed like a typical happy family, Lauri Waterman and Rachelle Waterman had their typical mother-daughter squabbles. Only that in this case, man, it turned fatal, leading to Lauri's gruesome murder. Rachelle maintained an online journal which she called My Crappy Life. and check this out. In the journal, Rachelle gave insights into the kind of relationship she had with her mother. Rachelle repeatedly described her struggles with her mom in her online journal, Most of what Rachelle shared were typical of what you would expect from a teenage girl, but there was more to it than just a mother-daughter fight. Beyond her anger-filled writings and in her journal, there was a strong feeling of hate and resentment towards her mother, the type that was more than just teenage rambling. See, on June 14, 2004, 5 months before her mother died, Rachelle posted in her journal saying, in quotes, "Well, I'm grounded. Last night, my mom went psycho, bitch, on me. I even got to fly downstairs," end quote. Yo, she put it all out there for people to see, huh? In her comments, Rachelle mentioned that she had been pushed down the stairs by her mom. This was not the first time she would comment about her many fights between the two of them. So she really expected to get away with this particular crime, and she all online right now posting all about the fights between her. So of course she was going to be a suspect. You know, you would think since she was a smart girl that she would think not to put that stuff online, but you know, I digress. In previous posts, Rachelle described how her mom was critical of her weight and her dressing, especially during the period when Rachelle decided to embrace an all-black look with black nail polish to match. But perhaps the real issue that Rachelle had with her mother was that Lauri strongly disapproved of Rachelle's relationships. I mean, Rachelle was about 15 or 16 years old when she started dating Brian Radel, who at the time was already in his 20s, so yeah, I would have a problem with that too. Rachelle's parents disapproved of the relationship, but that did not deter the fine Rachelle, who went on to date Jason Arrant, a friend of Brian's, who was introduced to Rachelle by Brian himself. Boy. Jason was a janitor at a local high school and was still living in his mother's basement when their relationship took off, of course. But Lauri was not impressed by their relationship one bit. To her, Jason didn't seem like a man who had any real goals for his future. Worse still, he was also almost a decade older than Rachelle. According to Rachelle, throughout her relationship with Jason, her mother clashed with her repeatedly. Rachelle always discussed her repeated clashes with Jason. Concerned about Rachelle's safety, Jason informed his friend Brian about the repeated clashes Rachelle was having with her mom. While he did this, Jason conceived the idea of kidnapping Lauri from her home and killing her while her daughter and her husband, Rachelle's father, was away. It was a plan that both Jason and Brian would execute with major consequences while receiving help from Rachelle, who would inform them when her father were away from home, leaving Lauri exposed and defenseless against the horrific attack she would soon receive at the hands of the two men. Following the arrest of Rachelle, Brian, and Jason, the case went to trial in 2006. And at the trial, Rachelle maintained her innocence. She admitted that she had discussed murder plans with Jason, her boyfriend at the time, but she also asserted that she had no direct discussion with Brian on any murder plan. Rachelle also insisted that she had no idea the plan would be executed by any of them. Yeah, right. However, on the night that her mother was killed, Rachelle wrote in her online journal, in quotes, "Just to let everyone know my mom was murdered," end quote. Rachelle's behavior in the days following the murder of her mother seemed rather awkward. Also, in one of the interviews with the police, Rachelle admitted to knowing that the murder was planned on a weekend that both she and her father would be out of town. Rachelle claimed repeatedly that she called Jason and told him not to follow through with the murder plan. But nah. However, prosecutors disputed that she ever had made that call, as there was no record to prove that the call was made. They also argued that even if she made the call to Jason, it did not negate her responsibility at the time, which was to alert the police. The prosecutors argued that Rachelle used stories of being mistreated by her mother to manipulate and otherwise emotionally immature Jason Arrant into getting rid of her mother. Jason Arrant testified that Rachelle had informed him that she and her father would be away from home on the weekend of the planned murder, incriminating Rachelle and involving her in the execution of the murder. Jason also mentioned that Rachelle was not worried about her mother. Instead, she was more concerned about the minivan getting destroyed because it meant that she would not be able to inherit. What the... Wow. Jason went ahead to spill more incriminating details about Rachelle's involvement, alleging that she helped him and Brian to get rid of the fingerprints and marks that were left at the crime scene. In defense of Rachelle Waterman, her counsel argued that it was in fact Jason Arrant who wanted Lauri out of the picture so that he could get on in his relationship with Rachelle. They argued that Arrant embellished the stories of abuse that Rachelle told him when he conveyed it to Brian Radel. The two men, Arrant and Radel, spent hours plotting over several plans to kill Lauri Waterman. One plan involved shooting Lauri from a vantage point near Craig High School. Radel was meant to wait for Lauri to drop off Rachelle for volleyball practice before he would take the fatal shot. But on that day, he forgot to vote for his rifle, and so the murder attempt was abandoned. Rachelle's defense team also argued that the mode of interrogation that Rachelle was subjected to was too harsh for a girl of 16, and that Rachelle was too young to fully understand her Miranda rights, which refers to her right to remain silent and to refuse to provide information to law enforcement. At the end of the first trial, the jury could not reach a unanimous, I'm country y'all, so you know what I'm talking about, verdict on the charges against Rachelle Waterman. Considering this, the presiding judge was left with no option other than to declare the case a mistrial. Also, in agreement with the objections from Rachelle's defense team, the judge threw out Rachelle's confession given to the police on the grounds that it had been coerced from her. The indictment against Rachelle Waterman were also thrown out by the judge. At the moment, there were no impending charges against Rachelle. Man, wow, man, that's wild. Following this mistrial, Rachelle was released on reduced bail. And since Brian and Jason had already pleaded guilty to the murder charges brought before them, they were both sentenced to 99 years and 50 years in prison respectively. But look here, however, in 2011, a retrial of charges against Rachelle Waterman took place. Now 22 years old, Rachelle was charged with murder in the first and second degree, conspiracy to commit murder, criminally negligent homicide, and burglary and kidnapping. Jason Arrant, her boyfriend at the time of the murder, refused to testify at her murder trial. But Brian Radel agreed to take the stand against Rachelle. This time around, the jury found Rachelle not guilty of murder, kidnapping, and the other more serious charges in the indictment against her. Of the 7 charges brought against Rachelle, she was acquitted of 6. However, she was found guilty of criminally negligent homicide. For Rachelle to have been found guilty of criminally negligent homicide, it meant there was enough evidence to prove that she had set a chain of events in motion that led to the death of her mother. And knowing the potential outcome of the events, she had failed to stop it. Following the guilty verdict, the prosecutors sought a 10-year prison sentence for Rachelle. However, Rachelle was sentenced to 3 years in prison. Rachelle has since completed her prison term, and today she is a free woman. Following her incarceration in 2015, Rachelle appealed her conviction in her mother's murder case, citing that because she was only 16 at the time, she should not have been judged as an adult. However, the Alaska Court of Appeal rejected Rachelle's appeal, stating that according to state law, defendants who are as young as 16 years old are tried as adults in serious criminal cases such as homicide. Now, she's a free woman. Rachelle is out there living her best life. Unfortunately, Brian Radel, Jason Arrant, they still locked up for committing a crime that she more likely masterminded, man. So you ain't dumb, you stupid. You're stupid. So that's all for today. If you like the video, please like, comment. Matter of fact, comment, have you ever heard of this case? And when you first heard of this particular case, how did you feel? And how would you feel if someone was planning to murder you in the same type of way? Let me know in the comment down below. Let's have a discussion about that. Alright, that's SS Unknown. I'm Glover, first name Glover, not last name, and I'm out. Peace.